Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to today's virtual field trip to Palm Beach County's Mounts Botanical Garden, where our topic of exploration today is wicked plants. Today's live stream event is brought to you by the Scientists in Every Florida School program and Mounts Botanical Garden located in Palm Beach County, Florida. Scientists in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program connects and builds long-term relationships between teachers and scientists in order to bring current scientific research and big data into classrooms in Florida and beyond. Mounts Botanical Garden is a national acclaimed attraction for Florida residents and visitors alike, and with a mission to inspire and educate through nature. Today, you'll be joined by Pam Soltis, the curator of molecular systematics and evolutionary genetics from the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida. We will be taking a tour of the garden in order to investigate some wicked plants and bone-chilling botany. Be sure to type your questions for Dr. Soltis in the chat box. But first, I'd like to introduce to you Diane Rabina, the Youth Program Manager of Mounts Botanical Garden, in order to set the stage for today's virtual field trip. Diane?
Well, hello, everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us today on our field trip to Mounts Botanical Garden. Just want to tell you a little bit about the garden. We are housed on 14 acres. We have 25 unique garden areas within our garden. There are thousands of plant species here. And we also have yearly art installations. Currently, we have the frog exhibit. If you were able to tune into our last field trip, you would have seen a little bit about that. But we do have art installations that come through here every year. Next slide. So why visit a botanical garden? Well, just like a zoo, you go to a zoo to see animals from all over the world. Unless you plan on doing a ton of traveling, you can come to a botanical garden and see all of these things in one place. So you'll see all kinds of plant species, flowers and trees from all over the world, different colors and textures and just beautiful, amazing specimens. So you come to a botanical garden to see things from all over the world that you wouldn't be able to see unless you did a lot of traveling. Here at the garden, we have some really cool stuff that you can see. Animals, just like when you go to a zoo, you see animals, they have, sharp teeth and claws and all these different things that help to protect themselves from other predators. We have a lot of plants that do that. They don't have the luxury of being able to run away or bite things. So in order to protect themselves, they have some amazing adaptations. And here are just a couple of the examples that we have here at the garden. On the left, you can see an angel's trumpet and Jimson weed, and they both use poison to protect themselves. The one in the middle is a pitcher plant, and that is actually a carnivorous plant. It eats animals in order to get extra nutrition because it lives in areas that don't have a lot of nutrients. And on the right, you can see some amazing examples of thorns and spines. We have a silk floss tree on the top and a zombie or voodoo palm on the bottom. And you can see those menacing spines on them. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of some of the things we're going to see when you come to the garden. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Dr. Pam Soltis from the Florida Museum.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really a great opportunity for me to get to share some really amazing stories about wicked plants with you today. And it's also a great opportunity for us to get to do a field trip to Mounts Botanical Garden. I'm really excited about this in particular because I've never been to Mounts, and it has just amazing resources and beautiful plants and gardens. And so at some point in the future, I'd like to do a real live field trip there, but until then, this virtual one will have to do. So I would also like to thank the Scientists in Every Florida School for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm really also excited to be able to share my love of plants, particularly some of these wicked ones, with you all this morning. Now, unfortunately, plants often are sort of ignored, and we maybe take them for granted, which is kind of silly considering the fact that we get lumber from trees, and we get food from plants, and we get beauty from plants. And yes, we get medicines. Many of our medicines are derived from plants. This is a compound that comes from a willow tree. You might know it better as aspirin. We also get many of our spices from plants, and all of these, thyme, rosemary, and oregano, come from the mint family, as does lavender. And the properties of these plants that enable these spices and fragrances and medicines all relate back to their chemistry. Now, this chemistry did not evolve as a way to provide us with products, but instead it evolved as a way to protect the plants from their predators, from herbivores, and maybe even from pathogens. And in some cases, the chemistry, these defenses that the plants have evolved, can be very, very potent. We just saw a picture of the angel's trumpet at Mounts, and we'll come back to that again in a little bit. Another example of a plant with really deadly chemistry is called monkshood. And this is a genus of plants that has species that grow all over the northern hemisphere. But there's a very interesting story about this species that traces to the 1800s in Scotland. And a family had invited a group of people over for dinner. One member of the family went outside to grab some horseradish plants to bring back to provide a little bit of flavoring for the evening's meal. But by mistake, the person brought in some monkshood. And the woman who was cooking went ahead and chopped up the plant and put it in the food. And well, she nearly killed all of their dinner guests. So you have to be very careful when you're sampling plants from nature, because this one has very powerful chemistry, as do many other plants. This one is called foxglove, and this is a plant that is often used in gardens, and it also occurs natively in parts of the Rocky Mountains and in other parts of the western part of North America. It's a beautiful plant, just like these others that we've been looking at, but it also has deadly chemistry. The interesting thing about its chemistry, though, is that this plant produces chemicals that are often used as medicines. So there's a fine line between having good medicinal properties and being deadly. This one is called white snakeroot, and this one also has some interesting stories associated with it. This plant occurs across the eastern and midwestern part of the United States, and it occurs in pasture lands and in meadows. And as the settlers moved across the continent, they learned that this plant was poisonous and they learned to avoid it. However, their livestock were not so smart. And it turned out that the cattle continued to eat this deadly plant. And although it didn't kill the cattle, the chemicals became concentrated in the milk and the butter and the cheese that were derived from those cows. And eventually people started dying and they couldn't figure out why. And in fact, this plant and this problem that transferred through the milk and butter actually killed Abraham Lincoln's mother when he was only 9 years old. So this plant has had a very profound impact on agricultural communities throughout Eastern North America. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that doctors and scientists finally figured out that it was this plant that was making people sick and not something that was naturally occurring in the milk itself. And the last example I'll mention here is the rosary pea. Now, this is a plant that occurs in Florida, and these beautiful seeds are actually very, very deadly. They have high concentrations of toxins. And although people have in the past thought, oh, it would be great to make a necklace or maybe a rosary out of these seeds, just inserting a needle through those seeds and making a necklace could provide enough toxin to make someone very, very sick and possibly even kill him or her. Now, we know that plants around the world produce lots of poisons and that these poisons have been then put to use by humans. And one example is curare, which is used to make a poison that is used on the ends of either darts or blowguns. Now, there are actually about 70 different species of plants that produce a poison that is used in this way. And you can see from the illustration a couple of people sitting in trees with these very, very long blowguns, and they would blow out a projectile that had this poison from the plants on the very tip. So in this case, these plants are wicked, not just to each other, but humans have even used them in ways to either provide food or possibly even fight against each other. Now, as Diane told us before, there is a lovely assortment of wicked plants at Mounts Botanical Garden. And these are just a few of them, and you've seen these already. But I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just showing you in a little bit more detail what some of these Mounts wicked plants are and what we might think about them. And I think, as you'll see, the concept of wicked plants can be a little bit confusing, because just like some of the other examples that I showed you, that there may be very nasty properties as far as humans are concerned, but there might also be some beneficial aspects too. So let's take a closer look at the voodoo palm, and Diane showed us this before. This is also sometimes known as the zombie palm. Now, natively, it occurs on the island of Hispaniola, and it gets its name because it has these long spines on the trunk. And these spines have been considered to be used as needles to make voodoo dolls. And here you can see a close-up of these long, sharp needles. So these obviously provide wonderful protection to the plant, but they've also then been taken by humans for additional use. In addition, the leaves can be used to weave hats and to make brooms, and the seeds can be used to feed livestock. So not only do these plants produce these sort of dangerous needles or spines, but they also provide some valuable aspects for human life as well. So if we had a wicked meter, we could say, well, it's a little bit nasty, but it's not too bad. So let's go on and take a look at another one. These are the pitcher plants, or as they're also sometimes known, monkey cups. Now, there are pitcher plants that occur all around the world, and this particular group of pitcher plants occurs in Australia, Madagascar, and Sri Lanka. Now, these plants are carnivorous. Now, carnivorous plants didn't evolve this habit and these adaptations just to be mean to the animals, but they grow in really poor soil areas so that it's not possible for them to get enough nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients from the soil. So instead, they get them from animal sources. Now, in some cases, they also get them from dead leaves and even animal droppings that might drop down into those pitchers. Now here we're looking down, down, down into one of these pitchers. And one of the things that is clear is that if something fell in, it would be very difficult to get out. Not only are the sides of the pitchers very slick and sometimes coated with waxy surfaces so that it's very difficult for an organism to get out, but there are also these teeth around the top that would prevent at least certain sized organisms from getting out again. So it's possible, as you take a look at this pitcher plant, that the pitcher might even form a habitat for certain sorts of organisms like this frog. So some can live in the pitcher plant without being harmed, but those that are actually the prey will fall down into the pitcher. They won't be able to get out, and then eventually they'll die of starvation. And once that happens, there are bacteria in the pitcher that can aid in digestion, just like we have bacteria in our digestive tracts. Now, these pitcher plants are so amazing that people want to collect them, and people from all over the world have collected them. The problem with that is that this has endangered many, many of the species, and more than half of the 100 species in this group of pitcher plants are endangered. Now here we can see a spider right here at the top, at the lip of a pitcher plant, trying to avoid falling in. And here we see an ant. And again, the inside this cavity at the bottom of the pitcher is liquid, some compounds that are secreted by the plant, plus some rainwater might accumulate there. And again, once the animal falls into the trap, then it will eventually starve to death, and then the bacteria and chemicals will break down the insect, or in some cases larger animal, to provide the nutrients that the plant needs. Now, interestingly, these carnivorous plants, these pitcher plants, can also have some medicinal properties. And here are just a few of the ailments that pitcher plant extracts can be used to help. So if we take a look at a wicked meter here, we might think of a pitcher plant as being pretty nasty by trapping those animals. But on the other hand, they do provide humans with benefits as well. Here's another example. This is the Jimson weed. And this plant is highly toxic. In fact, all parts of the plant are poisonous. Now, it gets its name from a very interesting source. Back in the late 1600s, there were British soldiers in the Jamestown, Virginia area, and they ate some salads and stews that had this Jimson weed in them. Now, the Jimson weed, nobody knew at that point that it was poisonous, and the soldiers became very ill, and they hallucinated and did crazy things for 11 days. There are some really funny accounts of some of the things that they did. And then they did recover, but they didn't remember anything of what had happened. So it was a pretty potent experience for all of them. So the plant became known as Jamestown weed, and eventually that was modified to Jimson weed. Again, these plants contain these really powerful chemicals, and in this case, they interfere with the brain. It can kill livestock, and if a person were to ingest enough of it, it could also be deadly. But just like some of these other plants, there's a fine line between being deadly and providing some valuable medicinal remedies. So here's our wicked meter for Jimson weed. Here's the angel's trumpet, which we already saw. And this is probably the most beautiful of all deadly plants. Now there are 7 species of angel's trumpet, but they're all thought to be extinct in the wild. And so these plants are propagated in botanical gardens and in personal gardens, but they've been banned in some areas because they are so toxic, both to people and to pets. And in fact, parts of Florida ban angel's trumpet from people's gardens. Now, there are some really strange things that can happen when angel's trumpet is ingested, leading to crazy behavior, loss of memory, and also some physical properties like respiratory problems and ultimately death if too much is ingested. But again, some medicines can be derived as well. So this is a really, really nasty plant, but in the right hands, like in the hands of scientists, it can provide some really important medicines. Now, all of these last examples have focused on the chemistry, but there are also a lot of other ways that plants protect themselves. We saw the example of the spines in the voodoo palm. This is a species of acacia. It's a relative of the bean and pea, and it has these really long thorns. And not only are those thorns good deterrents to herbivory, the thorns also house ants, and not just any ants, but really aggressive ants. And so if another organism came to feed on one of these plants, then these ants would attack. So here you can see the ants crawling out of the hole where they live inside of these long thorns. And these ants, again, are very aggressive. And the combination of the thorn and the ants provides really great protection for these plants. And now here are some pitcher plants that are from Florida. We don't have to go to the tropics. We don't have to go halfway around the world to find pitcher plants. These occur right in northern Florida with many large populations in the panhandle. These sundews are also carnivorous plants. They have lots of hairs with really sticky goo, and they're able to trap insects that way as well. So these are called sundews. And the closest relative of the sundews is, yes, that most wicked of plants, the Venus flytrap. So I'd like to show just a couple of videos to show these carnivorous plants in action. So here's the Venus flytrap.
The Venus flytrap. Like the sundew, it makes itself very attractive, oozing nectar across the brim of each leaf. But any visiting insect had better watch out for these 6 tiny hairs. This fly has to tread carefully. If it strikes one hair, it can carry on feeding, but a timer has been set. A second strike in less than 20 seconds, and the fly is doomed.
Yikes!
An electrical impulse is triggered, and the leaf snaps shut in just a fraction of a second. The tips lock together like prison bars. If the fly is very big or very small, it may just manage to escape. But most are trapped and die.
So that's pretty nasty, isn't it? Now here's an example of a pitcher plant that is not just capturing insects, but take a look at this. Whoops. That's it. It's trapped.
Ever imagine that a plant could devour such large creatures?
And there's a Venus flytrap getting the a baby frog as well. And our last example here is a sundew.
When an insect lands on these leaves, its legs instantly become tangled in a gooey mess. As the insect struggles to break free, it only gets more legs and wings caught. But wait, it gets better. Sundew can move their tentacles. That's right, these plants can move. Shortly after catching an insect, a sundew will begin to move its tentacles to cover an insect. Some species can even move their entire leaves, wrapping them around their prey. Sundews aren't the...
Isn't that amazing? So sundews and Venus flytraps are very closely related, and they're both able to have this sort of movement. But that's very unusual for plants. Those are among the most wicked in terms of their ability to capture prey. Now, this was just a very brief introduction to some of our most wicked plants. And I'd like to let you know there are almost 500,000 species of plants on our planet. And there are so many more wicked plants out there still to be discovered. Now, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the time we have left. But you can also go to our lab's website, which is shown here, and find out more about what we do in terms of plant research. And then my email address is also here on this one, and we can end here. So thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Soltis, thank you so much for helping us learn all about plants. I'm really excited to transition into our Q&A session. So if you have any questions for Dr. Soltis, please write them in the chat box down below. We're going to start with a question from Emma, who's in 4th grade, and she asks, what type of plants do you study?
Oh, that's a very good question. I actually study a number of different types of plants. One of the most commonly studied ones in our lab is a relative of a daisy or sunflower. And we study that plant to learn more about the genetics of these plants.
Josh, who's 14, asks, are there any plants that mimic a wicked plant to avoid predation?
Aha, so sort of like situations that we see in butterflies, right? Where there are mimics. I'm trying to think of some good examples of that. I'm not sure that plants have figured that one out. That's a very good question. I might have to look into that a little bit more. Thanks for that one.
Amy asks, do plants have nerves like animals?
Well, they're not the same kind of structures as the nerves of animals, but they do have some sensory abilities. So we saw the cases of the Venus flytrap and the sundew that can move in response to prey, but there are other types of plants that can move in a way to like track the sun. So they keep the flowers always, or their leaves always facing toward the sun. And we don't understand a lot about how that works, but they do it more with chemistry than with actual nerve molecules.
Bruce is wondering, are wicked plants found mostly in the tropics or throughout the world?
Well, most plant species, there are more plant species in the tropics than in other parts of the world. So, and there are definitely more wicked plants, more really nasty poisonous plants, I think, in the tropics. But part of it might just be due to the fact that there are more species to begin with. I haven't actually looked at the proportions to see if it's sort of the same. But my guess is that there are more nasty, wicked plants in the tropics than in other parts.
Abby, who's 9 years old, asks, are there any wicked plants who have a very pretty smell to them?
So yeah, so some of those really beautiful wicked plants with the beautiful flowers also are very, very fragrant. So some of the ones that I showed earlier, like the monk's hood and the foxglove, and even sometimes the angel's trumpet, can smell really good, and that fragrance is used to attract pollinators. But then, and you know, we might think that that's really nice too. So they're beautiful, they smell good, but you have to be very careful around them.
Tiana is wondering, how come there are some plants that are toxic, but that can also be used for medicine? And how did people figure that out?
Oh yeah, really good questions. So people have been making use of plants for, well, since people became people, really. It was part of our adaptation, part of our own evolution. And so sort of trial and error is how we've learned what are useful plants and what are not useful plants. So a lot of things in small doses might not be very, very potent, and therefore could be valuable. But if you get too much of them, then they're poisonous. And a lot of times traditional medicines provide us with clues that there might be some particular compound that would be really valuable. So for example, with aspirin, the ancient peoples of China, which is where the particular willow species grows, identified this plant as something that was very useful for helping with pain. And so later, as scientists started looking into this, they identified the particular compound, which we now use as aspirin. And that same sort of scenario is probably what's happened most of the time.
JB is wondering, can plants be host to a deadly virus similar to animals and pass something to humans?
So there are definitely viruses and other pathogens, bacterial and also fungal, that affect plants. And there are some cases where those pathogens leave signals or compounds on their own that can be then passed on to humans. And some very good examples have to do with even our history in the US. So there's a type of fungus that inhabits grains or attacks grains, and like barley and rye and maybe even wheat. And when people were making bread from these diseased grains, the fungal compounds were incorporated. And it can lead to really kind of crazy behavior, sort of like the things that we described for some of these wicked plants, but these are actually wicked fungi. And this led to the situation of the Salem witchcraft in Massachusetts earlier in our country's history. That the women were acting crazy, not because they were crazy or possessed or witches, but because they had actually ingested this compound that came from a fungus. So it wasn't the fungus itself, but it was some of the byproducts of it that made people sick and kind of crazy.
Scarlett asks, are Venus flytraps at all dangerous to humans?
The Venus flytraps are great pets. So they are not at all dangerous to humans. Sometimes in these photographs and things, they look like they're much larger than they are. Typically that trap, if you haven't seen one in person, is about the size of maybe a fly or something, and that's where most of them get their name. There are some that are bigger. We saw that one with the small frog being trapped as well. But they won't hurt humans, and they aren't toxic from a chemical perspective. So they make really nice plants to have in your terrarium in your house. So I could strongly recommend that.
Bill is curious, what is your favorite region that you and your lab have traveled to study plants or wicked plants in general?
Ooh, wow. Well, I'd have to say I almost never visited a place I didn't like. So there's always something interesting. And as I mentioned, with 500,000 species of plants, there are always amazing plants to look at. So I love to go to parts of Florida, like the Lake Wales Ridge. It's a beautiful area with a lot of unique plants. I love to go to the parts of North Central Florida. I love to go to the Panhandle. Other parts of North America are also amazing. The Pacific Northwest, the Alaska. I've done field work in China and in South America. It's all great.
Patrick asks, are poison ivy or poison oak considered to be a wicked plant?
I would say those are also wicked. I'm very susceptible to them. So they're very wicked from my perspective. But some people are not very susceptible or not susceptible at all. So that's an interesting situation. So if you really start delving into some of these plants, you can find out that there is chemistry in the group of plants that makes a whole group sort of wicked in one way or another. So poison oak and poison ivy are in a family that also includes cashews, and some people get allergic reactions to cashews. Also mangoes are in that group. Some people get have allergies to mangoes. So there's a bunch of chemistry there in that particular group that makes them sort of wicked to very wicked, depending on your susceptibility.
All right, Dr. Soltis, we have time for just a few more questions. Laura asks, is Angel's trumpet poisonous to the touch?
So I think you really have to ingest the Angel's trumpet in order for there to be any problems. But one thing you have to be careful about when you're visiting a garden or a place that has some of these very toxic plants is that sometimes there might be oils that are secreted onto the plants, and you might get them on your fingers. And then if you rub your eye or touch your face, you might end up actually causing some severe irritation for your eyes and maybe other parts of your skin. So they're not poisonous in the way that they would make you sick, but they could cause some physical damage, for example, to your eyes. So you have to be careful.
Lane is curious, is there specific criteria that scientists look at to determine a plant being wicked?
So this concept of wicked plants is sort of a popular view, but there's a really nice book, which sort of, let's see if I can put this up here. It's the book that I showed in a couple of my slides. It's called Wicked Plants. It's by Amy Stewart. And the subtitle is The Weed That Killed Lincoln's Mother and Other Botanical Atrocities. And the point really is that plants are often ignored and shouldn't be, and we need to be careful about them. So that's part of her motivation for writing that book. I would say probably scientists would generally refer to them as poisonous or carnivorous or something that's a little bit more descriptive than that term wicked, but wicked really captures the imagination. So we do like to use that also.
Josh is hoping you could identify maybe one of the most rare plants in the world.
Well, one of the most rare plants in the world actually that's not extinct in the wild, occurs in the Lake Wales Ridge in Florida. And it's called Florida ziziphus. And until about 10 years ago, about 20 years ago, until 20 years ago, we thought it was extinct. And then 2 locations were found at about 20 years ago. And now we know that there may be a couple hundred individuals left in the entire world. And all of this is right near Sebring and Avon Lake and in that area. So that's one of the rarest plants in the world.
All right, Dr. Soltis, thank you so much. Is there anything you would like to leave our attendees with? Any final thoughts?
Well, I just hope that maybe this talk has raised people's awareness about plants and how amazing plants are. It's not to say that animals aren't also amazing, but plants maybe deserve a little bit more respect than what we typically give them. And if you do have any further questions, or if we didn't have time to answer your question, I'd be happy to answer them by email. So please feel free to contact me. Thanks, and it was great sharing this with everyone.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Soltis. At this point, I'm going to hand things over to Stephanie for some closing remarks. Stephanie, you're on mute.
Why, thank you for that. I'll try that again. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on today's call for curious characteristics about certain plant species. And we want to give a very, very special thanks to Dr. Soltis for being our tour guide today. You can learn more about all of our programs by visiting the websites you see here on your screen. And you can also find a recording of today's field trip and a number of educational resources about plants by visiting the UF Thomson Earth Systems Institute's YouTube channel and the Scientist in Every Florida School website, where you'll find a listing of upcoming virtual events, including our next collaboration with Mounts Botanical Garden called Wild Architecture. This will be on May 20th at 10 a.m. Again, we would like to thank all of you for being here, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, bye-bye.